A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
I remember sitting in class in grad school, counseling theory and practice, with other eager therapists and psychologists. Our task that day was to give an example from TV or film of a therapist interacting with a client that mirrored how we would like to interact with clients in the future. Luckily, the professor offered to go first and started with an example of what not to do in the counseling room. You may remember the scene she played for us. It was with comedian Bob Newhart in his sketch Stop It, about a therapist, Dr. Schweitzer, whose method of advice seemed completely ridiculous at first glance. Basically, Bob Newhart is counseling a young woman who has several concerns, including a fear of being buried alive in a box. He tells her he has 2 words to cure her: stop it. And the young woman is understandably distressed and tries to continue to talk to him, but he keeps repeating, "Stop it." Finally, when she has had enough and is ready to leave, Newhart offers her 10 life-changing words. "Stop it, or I'll bury you alive in a box." Hilarious skit, but a terrible counseling and therapeutic interaction. Today's scripture can feel a little like this skit, playing out on a boat in a storm with a checked-out Jesus who seems impatient with the disciples who are bothering him. It could be said that the biblical message about fear and being afraid takes a similar approach to Bob Newhart. When people of faith struggle with fear and worry, someone will inevitably, even with the best of intentions, offer the pat response of, "Do not fear, do not be afraid," as a way of saying, "Stop it." Throughout Scripture, these words, "do not fear," are sometimes interpreted as a directive more than a choice. From Abraham and Moses to Mary and Joseph and Jesus, the theme of fear and being afraid is often seen or portrayed as a lack of faith. Orders coming from messengers who somehow believe that just by saying "do not fear," that the fear should just go away, or that these simple words should dissolve what is a true and legitimate feeling. It's as if the very ones experiencing the fear are expected to just stop it. Like it's that easy because someone told us to do it. From when they saw Jesus walking on water to the post-crucifixion world and locked themselves in the upper room, the disciples lived with fear on a daily basis. While there was comfort and assurance in Jesus' presence, there was also a great deal of fear and well-founded fear. If you notice and really look at Jesus' words and interactions, though, he doesn't deny the situation is scary or even dangerous. Now, as a parent, I can think of many times when I have tried to reassure my children when they were afraid, and sometimes when I was afraid. Like when at the doctor's office getting shots or at the dentist, and they would squeeze my hand as hard as they could, looking for some sort of solidarity in pain and reassurance. Or when I would stand in a cold pool with my arms outstretched, encouraging them to just jump. Or at night when they were frightened of the dark, and I would, like with Ghostbuster skills, come in to sweep the room and spray the monster be gone solution that we had made up to make sure there were no monsters or clowns hiding under the bed. I would like to imagine Jesus in this scenario having the same care and tenderness towards us and the disciples, rather than interpreting his response as a rebuke or a dismissal of what the disciples were actually feeling and experiencing. And to be honest, I can see this text from a lot of different perspectives. Jesus needed a rest to be away from the crowds. The sea, technically a lake, seemed calm initially, and no one was in distress. And after all, these guys were fishermen. They knew the area well, like the back of their hands. So Jesus understandably just wanted to rest his eyes. I'm the first to admit that I love a good nap. I have pro status when it comes to napping. Especially when my kids were younger, I longed for 60 minutes of uninterrupted sleep, which didn't come easy or often. Now, it would make for a better rest knowing that my kids were safe, cared for, and had what they needed. Often, my mom would come and visit us in DC for an extended time every summer when the kids were out of school. She loved the time with us, especially them, and I could usually work in a nap or two during her visits. I remember once when my son, not quite 3, was playing in our yard with my mom, and he nearly ran in to the front of a car. In an instant, he ran. He thought he was playing a game with her, and in a moment of panic, she yelled at him, snatched him up, and began to cry. Sam was so confused. His beloved Nana had yelled at him and she was crying, so then he started crying. My mom was scared and Sam was scared too. I heard all this outside and woke up from my nap and noticed them both on the ground, looking at one another, tears flowing. Now, can you imagine in that moment if I would have responded to either of them with, "Why are you afraid?" In that same way, I think it would be rather disingenuous to treat the disciples' fear as unfounded or Jesus' response flippantly as one who didn't want to be bothered enough to wake up or care about the concerns of those closest to him. The placement of this interaction between the disciples and Jesus in the Gospel of Mark comes early in Jesus' ministry. The intent throughout the Gospel of Mark is to establish Jesus as one who is present in the daily life of the community of followers. At issue are also fear and faith, so much that we find 6 examples in the Gospel of Mark of how the disciples were said to be seized by fear. And yet, in each of those moments, there was a noted presence of God. I always find it helpful to zoom out in any biblical story and consider why a story, a miracle, or interaction was recorded, and why it would be considered particularly relevant to the community at that time. Dr. Sharon Ringy of Wesley Theological Seminary, in her commentary about the Gospel of Mark, reminds us that Mark's church was living in the shadow of a traumatic war of the Jews against Rome that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. If Mark's account of Jesus' life and ministry were to be good news for the church, the people needed to hear a word of hope that in the midst of the storms and chaos through which they were living, and many of them were dying, that there was in fact a crucified and risen Christ that was with them. And really, isn't that what we all want to know? That God is with us and that we are never alone? Jesus on the sea that day was not only a calming presence in the chaos around the disciples, but also to the chaos within them. The author of Mark, by this story's inclusion, is invoking memories of God's faithfulness throughout time and place. A God who liberated Israel from slavery in Egypt through the Red Sea, who brought Noah to dry land and delivered humankind from the threatening waters that we read about in Psalms. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is established as one who is with the disciple and with us in the chaos. But there is still the question, why are you afraid? I think it's safe to say that most of us have some experience with fear. We have all had some kind of situation or thought that instills a fear in us. Some fears are more common, like the fear of heights or spiders or snakes or public speaking. And some fears are more internal and often less expressed, like fearing the future or fear of losing mobility or our health or independence or the loss of a loved one or a fear of death itself. I imagine that most of us can agree that fear is a part of life, of living. Our lives have a way of teaching us that change involves transition, and with transition, there comes some loss, and with loss, some grief, and often fear. C.S. Lewis, the Irish-born Oxford scholar and author of 40 books, including The Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity, had his share of painful events in life. His mother died of cancer when he was a young boy. He was sent away to boarding school with an abusive headmaster who later was declared insane. He was wounded in World War I, and his father failed to visit him in the hospital despite his pleadings. Lewis had a lot of cumulative losses and grief. However, he would go on to describe the death of his wife, Joy, as the most painful event of his life. You may have seen the movie Shadowlands and recall the strange circumstances surrounding his marriage to Joy. Lewis and Joy married in midlife, both at a crossroads of sorts. 1 year after Lewis and Joy were married, Joy was diagnosed with cancer. After a few rounds of treatments, there was a time of remission and life seemed okay again. But within 3 years, the cancer returned and Joy died. The loss of Joy plunged C.S. Lewis into the depths of grief and pain. Following Joy's death, Lewis kept a journal and wrote down his thoughts with no intent of ever publishing or sharing them. He found writing his thoughts down helped get them out of his head. And then, only a few years before his own death, in the midst of his own life review, Lewis had a change of heart and went on to publish perhaps his best-known book, a journal of his grief, A Grief Observed, under a pseudonym. Now, ironically, when the book first came out, many people thought it would be helpful to Lewis, and he received many copies of his own words as gifts. His book, A Grief Observed, showed the process through which Lewis lived with grief and the messiness of moving through it. He wrote in A Grief Observed that no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. He said, I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. This was the same man who had faced death and war and who had also avoided places that he and his wife had enjoyed. Lewis acknowledged that he was afraid of his thoughts about God and afraid of what the future would bring. If you read the book and his words, they convey a sense of distance from God, what the 16th century Spanish monk John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, where heavens seemed like they were brass bouncing back any prayer that was sent heavenward. Lewis wrote, in the depths of his pain and fear, what he dreaded was not a God after all, but the possibility of knowing what God is really like, wondering if God really cared. C.S. Lewis was living the Psalms, and his anger at God was palpable. Over time, he concluded that there was no sudden transition of fear, anger, grief, and pain to warmth and light, but there was a change from when he thought he was in the boat alone, only to realize he wasn't alone after all. So Jesus' question, "Why are you afraid?" makes me think that perhaps Jesus wasn't asking what he already knew the answer to, because the disciples' fear was obvious and understandable, but rather that Jesus was asking about their faith, reminding them of what had sustained them thus far. With everything happening, it made sense for the disciples to doubt, to struggle, to wonder about this Jesus they were following, and about a God who didn't seemingly intervene when Jesus was put to death. Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhist monk, author, poet, and advocate for peace, wrote, "Fear keeps us focused on the past and worried about the future. And if we can acknowledge our fear," he says, "we can realize that right now we are okay. And in doing so, acknowledging it, it takes away some of the power that fear holds." I think the question Jesus asked of his disciples is worth asking of ourselves. Why are we afraid? And what are we missing in the present moment because of our fear? It's so easy to get caught up in fear. Just look around, listen to the news. There are a lot of frightening things happening in the world. And it is very human for us to respond to them with fear. But it's one thing for us to feel fear, and it's another thing for us to live in fear. Too often, we don't just feel fear, we turn it into something that occupies our whole life and how we move through the world. My friends, fear takes life and consumes it. Fear breeds control, and often people who live in fear feel compelled to remain in control and frequently control others and even attempt to control the world around them. All from a place of fear, because life beyond control is simply unimaginable. Fear finds a crack like water and interferes with every part of our lives, especially with our ability to love, both in giving and receiving. The text read today in Mark is more than just another miracle story. As scholar David Jacobson noted, there are storms and there are storms. This one was huge for the disciples that day on the sea. The center of worship had been destroyed, and the cultural, religious center of the people no longer existed. And in the midst of all this chaos, when people believed the world could be ending, the Gospel of Mark reveals in the text not a miracle worker who makes all the fear disappear, but an embodied presence found in Jesus, just as he was, napping and all in the midst of fear. In this story on the sea, and in the question of Jesus, why do you fear? We gather that God's power isn't in the control of creation or in the control of people, but rather in being in covenant and relationship with them and with us. This isn't a God imposing divine will or using magic tricks for some and not others when we are afraid, facing trials, doubts, test results, or a crisis of faith, But this is a God sojourning with us as we fumble around and make our way in the world, questioning if we are alone and if God really cares. And I wonder what it means to our faith to trust in a God whose power is not in miraculous interventions or preemptive strikes in the cosmic battle against suffering and evil, but instead is revealed in the coming alongside of us, journeying with us, suffering with us, staying with us in the boat when the storms come. We can take comfort from the text that in the chaos of our lives, God is with us as the storms of life are raging. And not just with us, but with all the world, in Ukraine and Gaza and Somalia and Syria, in places where chaos bears down as it did on the disciples. And there is a collective fear that rattles our sense of safety. Today's chaos could be climate change, warring factions, or extremism, just to name a few. And the news thrives on fear, exploits and exacerbates fear as a way to drive up ratings and make news. And politicians and preachers pile on, often furthering fear with rhetoric and apocalyptic hype about the end of time and language that divides us from our shared humanity and common good. So let's look at this question from Jesus one more time. Rather than hearing him say, "Why are you afraid?" as a rebuke, instead, what if we heard Jesus as more genuinely curious, asking, "Why are you afraid?" like we would ask and say to a crying child, bringing us back to the present moment, to see a Jesus who is in the boat with us, not shaming us for our fear, but reassuring us of his presence with us, with all, then and now. Amen. Friends, our takeaways for today are simply this. Jesus asks us why we fear, not to shame us, but seeking to understand us. And fear robs us from the present moment, making it difficult to see what is right in front of us. And finally, God's power isn't found in the control of creation or in the control of people, but known through relationship, a God who is with us. May it be so.